Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest is Myron Orfield, a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and one of the country's foremost authorities on metropolitan governance. On this show, we'll discuss metropolitan inequality, land planning, and his career in the Minnesota legislature. Orfield, who is director of the Institute of Metropolitan Opportunity, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and a faculty member with the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs, is a national authority on race and local and regional economics. In 1990, Orfield was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives, where he served for 5 terms, and to the Minnesota Senate in 2000, where he served for 1 term. Myron, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we'll want to talk about your experience in government, but before we do that, you study metropolitan inequality.
Yeah.
So what is that, and why should we care about that?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is we become a multiracial metropolitan nation. Who's doing well in that effort and who's not? You know, and some parts of the country are dealing with their social and economic diversity and thriving, and some parts are not thriving. So, I mean, you can take a look at a place like Louisville, Kentucky, which is very racially integrated and very cooperative, and it's thriving in the world economy. On the other hand, Detroit is not dealing with these issues very well, and it's kind of, the cities are at war with the suburbs, and the suburbs are at war amongst themselves, and they're not doing too well.
But it's not just the city and suburbs that are at war. You say that it seems that in a lot of places, the downtown, formerly decaying part of downtown, have been rehabbed.
Yeah.
Maybe as part of the real estate boom that happened before, and the inner ring suburbs are the ones that are really hurting.
I mean, this is one of the things. I think people thought for a long time that all poverty and diversity was a city issue. And now we're finding that there's as many poor and non-white people live in the suburbs in the United States as there are in central cities. In fact, there's more. There's more poverty now in the suburbs, and a larger share, the majority of non-white families live in the suburbs. Not all suburbs are the same, though. The inner ring, the older suburbs, tend to be experiencing a lot more stress and poverty and disinvestment and higher taxes, lower services than some of the outer suburbs. Some of the outer suburbs develop with just modest homes, and they never really develop a tax base that will sufficiently support their schools. Other suburbs develop with malls and office parks and expensive homes, and they do very well.
So what determines, in your opinion, which are doing better and which are not? You mentioned Louisville is doing great.
Yeah.
And Detroit is not.
Well, economic growth is also a bottom line. You know, which areas are gaining jobs, which areas are gaining income, which areas are gaining prosperity. That's part of it. That's often closely related to how racially and socially segregated the metropolitan areas are. So a place like Louisville is dramatic. Louisville and Detroit both have the same percentage of poor people and African American people. Louisville's a lot less segregated, and it's a lot more of a cooperative place where the local governments, in fact, in Louisville have merged together into a large single government and the school district governments, and they are really doing well. They're much less segregated in Detroit. They're growing economically strong and moving into the world economy in a very impressive way. Detroit isn't. Where I'm from, the Twin Cities, we have lots of cities, but we have structures that we can cooperate with. We've moved from sort of an Articles of Confederation in the Twin Cities to something more like the Constitution. And we have structures that we can go out and compete in the global economy, that we can allow poor kids to access to higher income schools and better opportunity. We're not perfect, but I think it makes a big difference.
Well, one of the narratives that we hear in Wisconsin, mostly from our friends in Minnesota, is how well the Minnesota economy is doing, in particular the Twin Cities, and how the Wisconsin economy is struggling by comparison. And often that is explained with what seems to me a fairly simplistic explanation of your politics are this and the other guy's politics are that. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? How did that happen there?
Well, I think that we had a very progressive business community that decided that the metropolitan area, which has 187 municipalities and 49 school districts, needed to work together better. And it needed to work together better to compete in the world economy. It needed to work together better to prevent the city from becoming poorer and the older suburbs from declining. it needed to figure out structures so that they could find self-interest to cooperate. We have a system called property tax sharing in the Twin Cities. So among 187 cities and 49 school districts in 7 counties, we share 40% of the business tax base. And it reduces disparities between our municipalities from 12 to 1 to 4 to 1. So every time one of our suburbs goes out to bring in a national and international employer and go out and try to get a biomedical company or a high-tech company, every single city, county, and school district benefit by that. So there's powerful reasons for them to get together. They also know that if poverty concentrates in the city, it's going to flow into the older suburbs and hurt those places. You know, if you're from Chicago, look at the south side suburbs of Chicago. They're much poorer and in much worse shape than the city of Chicago is. And if Chicago had been more like Louisville, if they'd been more like Minneapolis, they'd be doing better. Detroit is even worse. And you want to move towards something that's in a successful model. You want to be a metropolitan area like Louisville or like Raleigh, North Carolina, or Portland, Oregon, or Seattle that's prospering, that's taking all the benefits of its diversity and making everyone stronger rather than separating out and fighting across a hedgerow.
So the issue with metropolitan inequality is not just a reflection of the national spread in inequality, which as an economist I can say, well, okay, there are returns to skills that are greater, and if you are lightly skilled, you're competing in a global labor market in a different kind of a way.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that that's not really the big picture here in terms of
Well,
what
I think there's a couple things going on. And I mean, one, you have the wage economy that you're talking about, the fact that a certain segment is falling behind because manufacturing employment is moving overseas, and that's one structure of inequality. There's also what I'm more interested in is spatial inequality. So how does the metropolitan area sort itself out? And I think metropolitan areas that sort themselves out so that all the successful people live in one suburb and all the poor people live in another one, they don't work very well. And in America is a country about mobility. It's a country about if you can land in an area of opportunity, and everybody should have a chance to a decent and equal school education, then they can make something of themselves. And in a place like Louisville, they can do that. In a place like Raleigh, North Carolina, they can do that. In a place like Detroit, all the schools in Detroit are terrible. Every single one of them is. And maybe there's a few, but almost every one of them is. And the places that fight amongst themselves and really sort all the poor into one small pocket, they don't do very well. They don't succeed very well. And the places that, at least spatially, try to work together. Small towns are a little bit like this. If you go to a small town in America, in that community, in the church, there's the banker and the doctor and the people that have less income. And they're a community of a variety of types of people that pull together and do a good job. In America, the metropolitan areas that decide to pull together and do a good job, and the ones that divide themselves into hundreds of fiefdoms and just shoot at each other don't succeed very well.
I used to have to travel to Detroit quite a bit in the 1980s, and something that struck me was 8 Mile Road.
Yeah.
So on one side of 8 Mile Road was Detroit. On the other side of 8 Mile Road, I think it was Southfield,
right,
and for maybe a couple of other suburbs.
Yeah.
And it was night and day.
Right.
And 8 Mile Road was purposely made, I'm sure, like the demilitarized zone.
Yeah.
So that, there was no way you could easily cross it.
That's right.
And that had to have been on purpose.
Yes, it was on purpose. And I mean, the 8 Mile Road divided Detroit from Warren, and, to the other, Southfield was on that border too. And when they built that road, one side was all white, and Southfield particularly was quite affluent. Warren was more of a blue-collar white place. They built that road, and Detroit declined, and then poverty surged over that road. And if you take a look at Southfield today, the schools are 92% black and poor. They were going to guard themselves from this, and now they've created a turmoil in Detroit, and it's swept through Southfield and hurt Southfield. Warren is experiencing the same thing. They were trying to create a separate wall between them, and now all the problems that Detroit had in the 1950s when these walls were built are fully present in Warren. So they decided to divide like that, and it didn't help. They're now reaping the whirlwind for that. They are in bad shape. We're in Louisville and other places that tried to work together. They're prospering. Everybody's doing well.
So, I guess that begs the question: what motivates people to come to the table? Because when we think about the American dream, especially the nuclear family, 1950s, 1960s, the whole idea was aspirational, right? Okay, we bought our house in this suburb, but what we really want to do is get to whatever the next suburb up the food chain was. And I mean, there's a sort of an assortment that goes on, and the more that disparity is created, the more demand there gets to be for people to get in there. So what breaks that cycle?
Well, I think if you think about where most people live, in a place like the Twin Cities, we don't have quite as many cities. Detroit has 400, and we have 187. But when you looked at the bottom line numbers of working together, the vast majority of people lived in suburbs that saw benefit from it right away. So we have a thing called property tax sharing among the regions. More than half of the suburbs, because of property tax sharing, every year get lower taxes and better services than they otherwise would. So it's easy for them. Over time, as the wealthier suburbs have seen how strong the region's economic growth is, they've seen that a healthy region is good for them. They're richer now than they would be if they were suburbs of Detroit, because they're connected to a prosperous metropolitan area. So the first stage is, when you think about this, the fact that when you draw a system like tax-based sharing, it makes the property tax system more stable. It keeps many of the suburban systems much more dependable and functional. It works better. We also have we have an urban growth boundary in the Twin Cities. And so a lot of the fully developed suburbs think that maybe if we're going to do public investment, we should rebuild the first and second tier suburbs before we build a new one out into a cornfield. And that makes economic sense. It's better to reuse the community and let it live another generation than just throw it away. In Chicago or in Detroit, they just throw away the first and second tier suburbs. They just are empty and abandoned, and they just move out further into the countryside. Detroit hasn't grown in population in 35 years, and it's grown 70% in land area. It's built 2 new rings of suburban communities so that people can move away from the inner ring suburbs. And they've had to finance that with no growth of capital. It hurts everybody.
Yeah, my own experience growing up in Chicago is that even the idea that the regional transportation networks would be extended, sometimes it's opposed by people who live in the farther out suburb, the ever farther out suburb.
Right.
Of course, there are limits to that, right? I mean, there's only so far away you can go to get an ever bigger house, and I guess maybe it's dependent upon energy costs as much as it is anything else, and road investment.
I think you're starting to see, with the price of gas, when it pops up over $4 a gallon, you start to see the price of houses in the far-flung suburbs decline. So there's some constraints on that.
I wonder how much of this is of this problem is generational as much as it is anything else.
Yeah.
When I look at younger people, who millennials in particular, but also Generation X, they grew up in a more diverse environment, generally speaking, than baby boomers like you and me.
Yeah.
So they don't seem to be as afraid of the other.
No.
Is one thing. And the other thing is there's something else happening where they seem to be attracted more to the services that an urban environment can provide. They don't seem to be in a hurry to buy houses. They're not even in a hurry to buy cars. If you look at vehicle miles traveled, it's dropped. I mean, some of that's because of the recession, but some of it's because there's a change going on here.
Right.
I mean, do you see that as a bright spot?
I think it could be. I think it depends on what kind of momentum it gets. I mean, I think young people particularly desire urban amenities. And particularly young people that have decent incomes want to live in a city that has a social life and that has amenities, that has arts and culture and amenities, and that has places to be and destinations. The question is when they are family forming and when they have children, where they're going to remain. A lot of central cities, you have central cities in the United States like Boston and San Francisco and Seattle that are much wealthier than their suburbs. You also have cities like Detroit that are a fraction, or Youngstown, or places like that that are just destitute. So cities have a variable outcome. I think, and the question is can we create viable life cycle places in cities for people to stay? And also the older suburbs. I think in some ways, the older suburbs of the United States are in the most trouble. Because central cities have a lot of assets they can build on. They have old buildings and they're central, they're the central place in the region often for services. They have hospitals, institutions like universities sometimes. The inner suburbs are often post-World War II residential communities that never had arts, culture, amenities. And many of the houses are well past the life that they were projected to lead. They were supposed to last for 30 or 40 years, and they're 60 or 70 years old now, and they aren't built to be fixed up.
They weren't necessarily built the way that their parents, built the homes.
That's right, yeah.
Who thought we build a home forever. I mean, it was part of the disposable American culture.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the family formation in that.
Yeah.
Here in Wisconsin, of course, a big political issue has been how do we manage public education? And in general, there's been a movement in cities to go toward more school choice, charter schools, et cetera. And that's been, of course, politically fraught.
Right.
And you've done some work in charter schools. So talk a little bit about what they mean, what they can do, what are some of the pitfalls associated with that approach?
Charter schools were created in Minnesota and during the time that I was in the legislature, and I voted for them. I think they were sold at the time as an idea to create choice and options for kids, that they'd create a race to the top, that they'd more successfully provide choice to kids of color and minority kids, and they'd be more integrated and more successful and competitive, that they'd create a competitive race with the public schools to do better. Sadly, I don't think that's what's happened. I don't think they've come out the way that I think that charters, I've done 3 studies of charters, the Brookings Institution and Stanford University, the Credo Center, other people have done. There's probably been 10 studies, and they all show that the Twin Cities, the charters have always underperformed the public schools. And particularly if you compare them in terms of income. So if you look at the poverty population of a charter school, it systematically underperforms the same public school in terms of diversity. So if you have a poor charter school, it does worse than a poor public school. If you have a rich charter school, it does worse than a rich public school. So and they should be doing better because they got the benefit of selection bias. The people that are making that decision to leave a system are thought to have more motivation and more ability than the people that don't make those decisions. And so they have these people that are making these decisions and they're doing worse. So this is grim. They also are not integrated places. They tend to either be very white or very non-white. And increasingly they are all black or all Latino or all Hmong. And they often come into neighborhoods in our cities where our public schools are not strong. And they say that this single race approach will do better for the kids. And it doesn't. The kids are in bad schools and they want to try something better. But they often get something worse. And the public schools have turned around and created single race programs to try to compete for market share. And so it's become, in that sense, a race to the bottom. In many of our racially diverse suburbs, our first and second tier suburbs are now maybe 30% non-white in their public schools. As they become 30% non-white, you'll often see an all-white charter school pop up in the midst of that community. And that'll drain off a lot of the middle-income kids. It'll hurt the financial system of the suburbs, and it doesn't do that well academically. It's a different population. So they've been not a successful thing. We pioneered them. I voted for them. We thought they'd be good, but I think they need to be changed. They need to be substantially reformed. And I'm sad to say that our model of charters is spreading out everywhere in the country.
It seems to have currency with a lot of folks who...
Yes. Across the political spectrum.
Yeah, and as an economist, when it makes sense, right? If you let people make choices exactly as you say, the ones that are most able are likely to be the ones that send their kids there. So to what do you attribute the poor performance?
Well, I think some of the charters are good. There's a small percentage, and they tend to get all the publicity. Maybe 5% of them that do quite well. So a lot of people think that all of them are like the 5% that get publicity. And some of the people that run charters are exceptionally capable. They really know what they're doing. But they're a fairly small percent. The large share of people that run charters used to run public schools, so they're not very different. Except now they're entrepreneurs and they're seeing a cash and revenue stream that they can maybe have a better retirement for and pay themselves a higher salary. They may not be as interested in the whole piece of it. And then there are a subset of people that truly believe that they can change children's lives, and they love children. Sometimes they're ministers or community leaders. They're really good people, but they've never run a school before. They've never run anything before. And they don't do a very good job. They're good people, but they don't do a very good job. And then at the bottom of the spectrum, there are 10 or 15% of the people that are just crooks that go in, and we've had 20 of our charter schools closed for misappropriation of funds. And so you have a spectrum of people that really know what they're doing, and they tend to get all the publicity. They're supported by the big foundations, and they have big press relations. You have people that create schools that are virtually indistinguishable from the public schools. You have people that are well-intentioned but don't know what they're doing, and their schools tend to fall apart, and then you have crooks.
So you mentioned you voted for these, and I want to actually talk a little bit about your time in the legislature.
Sure.
Most of us have never had that experience, let alone basically 6 terms in the legislature.
Yeah.
So what's that like? What's it like to run for office? I mean, what are the challenges? What did you not expect? And what's it like to actually participate?
Well, it's a very different world from the academic world. It's almost as different. I've done a few things in my life. I've been a professor for a long time, but I was a lawyer in a big law firm. I was a government prosecutor for a while. I ran a small company for a while. And it feels to me like all the things that I've done have closer relationships than politics and academia. They seem to be the furthest apart. Although, I think that it's very exciting to be in public office. I enjoyed running for office. It's a sense, I ran for office in a neighborhood I grew up in, and so it was a way to get acquainted with what was happening and to know about people's lives. And in Minnesota, when you run for office, the districts are, my House district was about 40,000 people, and my Senate district about 80. So I get to know pretty much everybody in the district. So it was a very human scale kind of grassroots thing, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's hard. Politics is hard sometimes when people have really different views. I think when I began in politics in the early 90s, there was more of an ability to reach consensus, or if you disagreed with each other, to find a middle ground. I think as time has gone along, it's become more polarized and harder to find a way to end the session or to solve the differences in viewpoint, and that's hard.
It seems that everything now is viewed through, okay, how does this affect Team Blue or how does this affect Team Red?
Yeah,
and it seems much less about finding solutions. It's more about making sure your party has its way on behalf of the large donors.
Yes,
maybe that's a little cynical.
I think it's become, and I think partly I think it's been driven by a lot of things, but particularly the media. I think there was a time in America where people had a common newspaper and a common set of newscasters at night who I think tried to be objective or tried to split the difference somehow. Mm-hmm. And I think now, Democrats listen to MSNBC and Republicans listen to Fox, and there's no common narrative anymore. And I think that all politicians strive to be in the media. They all want to be on television and so forth. And I think that this drives. I think this separation of the media and the fragmentation of the media has driven it, and I think money coming into politics, it pushes people into their separate worlds where they don't share common things to talk about.
And it seems, I'm not sure about the state level, but it's certainly at the House level, U.S. House. From the time you get there, you have 2 years to raise enough money to finance your next bid.
Yeah, no,
and
I think
U.S. Senate campaigns are in some states insanely expensive things.
Yes, no, they are, and I think that's a huge barrier to people. I mean, you want to have a cross section of the country and people that will do this, and the costs are high, mm-hmm. and we've got to think about a way that we can help people from a variety of occupations and incomes participate. I think the more you have people that represent the average person or the mix of people, the people that represent their different communities that really care about them, I think the better outcomes you're going to get.
Yeah, it seems quite difficult for somebody who isn't of fairly substantial means to even run for dog catcher anymore. Not only do you need the money, but you need the freedom to be able to do all the kinds of things you need to do. You have to fight the battles. It seems like to get on the ballot requires a law degree, just about. It seems like it's not easy to participate and contribute in government service.
But it's a very important thing, and it's a very rich thing. I think that people that actually get through those barriers and participate are happy, and it's one of the things that they feel proudest about. So I think it's worth doing. We've created some high hurdles, but we have to support people that want to do it. We need good people of all political parties to participate.
So, I think most of us sort of picture this cigar smoking, backroom deal making kind of a thing. I'm guessing that the state house in Minnesota is in fact smoke free. So that's
one of the first states in the country.
I'm sure
we had a representative named Phyllis Kahn.
So, but how does the sausage actually get made?
It's I think that the conference committees are particularly, if you're thinking about where you have. If you have really different viewpoints, they tend to get resolved in conference committees. And there are, I think people, a lot of times people have things they want to accomplish, and they try to figure out how they can get support for what they want to accomplish by supporting other things, and it can become very convoluted in that process. I think in general, if the state legislatures were unicameral, I think we'd have a better government, and I think it'd be more transparent. I think there's a powerful reason that the United States needs a House and a Senate, because we were trying to deal with a really complicated political compromise, trying to bring states into the union. So you have one body that's popularly elected, one, but most states don't need that, and I think it creates a lot of mischief. And I think if there's sausage being made, I think it's being made in conference committees.
And I mean, essentially, there does need to be sauce. I mean, there does need to be compromise.
Yeah.
There needs to be a place for that to happen, and people voting for things that maybe they're not in love with, but that's how you move stuff forward.
Yeah, no, it's a practical part of politics.
I think a lot of the difficulty, though, goes back to what you just said. People aren't sharing the same television programs. We don't have this shared American experience that maybe we thought we had.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure in the 1950s that if you lived in rural America, you necessarily had the same experience as you did in the suburbs of New York or something like that. But I mean, people mostly watched I Love Lucy.
Yeah.
They read Life magazine.
Yeah.
They listened to the same radio shows. And in a town there were 2 or 3 newspapers, but you have one in the morning, one in the afternoon.
Right.
There was that commonality. There isn't that anymore.
No, I mean, we're becoming more fragmented. Our politics are. We have separate media, and people. If you read, there's a book I read not too long ago called The Big Sort. And it was about, Democrats tend to move into suburbs that Democrats live in, and Republicans tend to move into suburbs that Republicans live in. And people that are in certain types of occupations tend to live in certain neighborhoods. And, and so we're fragmenting. Not only we have separate medias, but we live in separate communities that never interact with each other. And I think that creates less of a common narrative. I think that one of the things, my father-in-law was the governor of South Dakota, a very conservative Republican, and I was a fairly liberal Democrat.
How'd that go?
Very well, I think. And I think we've always been very close. We disagree on lots of things, but I think one of the things that I think we see that common thing in is the small town that he lived in and that he represented. It's a microcosm of everybody, and they're a community, and they care about each other. And I think too often in metropolitan America, the haves live in one place, the have-nots live in another place, and they don't talk to each other, they don't know each other, they don't have any common experience, and they view each other as the enemy. I think the small town does a better job, and I think we're in a multiracial, complicated society, and we got to use the strengths of every part of our society to continue to grow better, rather than to separate ourselves out into a million fragments that don't get along.
Well, to me, the thing that always kind of makes me nervous is when we start to say that this particular group with this set of practices, these values, et cetera, well, those are the path to success. Whereas this other group that has different values, different culture, they're not on a path to success. And I know, like the whole David, the Patrick Moynihan kind of approach to that. How do you deal with that and still preserve the idea that there is some equality between different cultures and their values? Because that's a slippery slope.
Yeah, no, it is a slippery slope. And I mean, I think about this. We all come from an immigrant past, except for the Native Americans who were here long before. We're the first immigrants, perhaps from Asia, but we all come, and we all have lost a lot as we've become Americans. My father passed away a little while ago, and as he was very old, he started to speak Norwegian. And I never knew how to do that, and there was a huge cultural heritage I'd lost in all of that. But I think there's something dynamic about America where people share all of this culture from these other places. It creates something greater than the sum of its parts. So I don't think there's a group that has the benefit. I think the shared experience of America is what's so great. There's a couple groups that don't get to share in that experience. So black people generally have been held out of that system by discrimination and segregation, and Latinos too, and to some degree Asian families. But those two groups never had the kind of experience that most of other immigrants had. They got separated, they were kept away through banking discrimination, mortgage lending discrimination, steering, and they never got to share that rich American experience. And I think that they should be able to.
Well, this has been fascinating. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Okay.
Although we could talk, 2 economists could talk about this all day long.
Okay.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed our show. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.